Yeah, so this is the idea of a loss and damage fund. What that really means is a pool of money set aside, contributed to by wealthy nations like Australia, for example, and the United States, that is there for developing nations that are already feeling the devastating effects of climate change. Think about places like Pakistan, where we saw those horrific floods earlier this year. And also right on our doorstep, our northern neighbours, the Pacific Islands, whose very livelihood is already being threatened by climate change. This idea of a pool of funds to be set aside to compensate those areas and help them deal with the effects of climate change will be on the agenda. And it's pretty important that it's on the agenda because it's been proposed a few times before, but it's actually been blocked by wealthy nations. So the fact that it's even made it on the agenda this year is pretty important. I don't think, Yvonne, that we are actually going to see any binding agreement or any firm commitment from this COP, but what we might see is that it goes on to next year's agenda to further these discussions. I did speak with the Minister who is here for Australia representing the government this week, the Minister for the Pacific, Pat Conroy, about this fund and where Australia stands on it. He said that in principle Australia has supported the discussion of it in the agenda because one of the closest links Australia has is with the Pacific, and that's one of their key purposes for being here at this conference, is to have discussions with Pacific nations. But he certainly stopped short of saying whether or not Australia would pledge or commit any money if it were agreed that this sort of compensation pool were to be established.
And Allyson, what are some of the other key issues that we'll see discussed at the summit?
Well, usually at events like this, it's 2 weeks of high-level talks, and at the end you get some sort of massive agreement that comes out where, 200-odd countries have signed their name to commitments towards improving things in the climate change space. That's not going to happen specifically at this conference because that's not really what it's about. So think of, for example, last year the likes of Glasgow or the Paris Agreement that came out of COP in 2015. Not going to happen here. What this is really about is accountability. It's about holding each nation to account for the commitments that they've made at previous COPs, because what good is a plan if it is not being implemented correctly? So I think a lot of the discussions here will happen around health checks on how each nation is going, whether or not developing nations need more assistance to be able to meet some of their targets. I'm talking in particular financial assistance, and whether or not wealthy nations are actually meeting the goals and targets they achieved, and whether or not they can actually exceed and surpass those targets. That's what this conference will be about. And although it probably doesn't sound quite as sexy that there won't be some big binding agreement to come out of it, a lot of people argue that it's actually more important that this conference is happening to keep nations on track.
And Allyson, Australia's Prime Minister is a notable absentee at this summit.
Anthony Albanese remains in Canberra this week. He says that other commitments like the Parliamentary Sitting Week this week and also the G20 conference mean that he will not attend the 2 weeks of this summit. Instead, he has sent a delegation including 2 ministers, as I mentioned before, the Minister for the Pacific, Pat Conroy. He will be here during the first week of this conference. Next week, it'll be the Climate Change Minister, Chris Bowen, and they'll be centred around those discussions with the Pacific. We do know that the US President, Joe Biden, is expected to attend. I want to just mention, though, it has been noted that Australia's Prime Minister is absent from here. Observers have had some commentary around this, given that Australia is vying to host this conference in 2026. It's a mammoth undertaking. It would be about the size of a Commonwealth Games, so a lot of discussions are needing to take place. And this would be the real opportunity for Australia to prove and sell its environmental and climate change credentials. So a notable absence of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese here, but the minister that I have spoken to says that they will serve the delegation well.
Allyson Horn, thank you.